They mocked them from the beginning, not with gunfire, not with bombs, with smirks. In the halls of the War Office, in briefing rooms filled with brass, and behind closed doors of Allied intelligence agencies, the idea was floated. America needed its own shadow force. The British chuckled. The French rolled their eyes. Even some U.S. generals balked. Spies? They scoffed. Sabotage? That's not the American way. War, in their minds, was tanks, artillery, divisions on the move, not typewriters in a cabin or explosives hidden in toothpaste tubes. The British already had the Special Operations Executive. The Germans had the Abwehr and the SS. The Soviets had the NKVD. But the Americans, a young nation still holding on to notions of gentlemanly conflict. But then came 1942, and with it, a realization. The Nazis weren't playing fair, and they weren't losing. They were infiltrating resistance networks in France, hijacking convoys in North Africa, feeding misinformation through neutral countries. And every day, the cost of American ignorance was being paid in blood. So a plan was made. A new force would be born, unseen, uncredited, and utterly unconventional. Its name? The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. And in the early days, it looked like every insult hurled at it might be true. The headquarters were thrown together. Recruiting was scattershot. Ivy League professors shared desks with safecrackers and linguists with former criminals. There were actors, boxers, teachers, and bartenders, men and women who had nothing in common except one thing. They didn't want to fight the war the usual way. The training was brutal: sabotage, espionage, cryptography, parachuting behind enemy lines, silent killing. At Camp X in Canada, and later in Maryland's Catoctin Mountains, what would become Camp David, they trained not like soldiers, but like shadows. One OSS officer recalled his first week. "We learned how to kill a man with a pencil. Then we broke for lunch. Then we blew up a train. On paper first, then for real." But training wasn't enough. They had to prove it could work. So they were sent out. Into France, into Italy, into Norway and Greece and Burma, behind enemy lines with false identities, untraceable codes, and orders to do whatever it took, to steal, to destroy, to confuse. And the first missions? They were disasters. In France, early OSS operatives were captured before their radios were unpacked. In Greece, a drop went wrong. The team landed in a German encampment. Few came home. The critics doubled down. "This isn't war," they muttered. "This is a fantasy." But the OSS adapted. They learned, they shortened missions, changed drop points, developed new encryption techniques. They partnered with the British SOE and leaned on local resistance. They found the gaps in German armor, not the steel, but the seams of communication, supply, and certainty. And then, something changed. Something small, but seismic. A Nazi train carrying vital radar components derailed in the Swiss Alps. No survivors, no clear cause. A key bridge in northern Italy collapsed overnight. No planes overhead, no artillery reported. A German officer in Paris defected, bringing with him the floor plan of the Gestapo's central office and a list of collaborators. And behind each of these moments was the OSS. The whispers began. Within the Wehrmacht, within the SS, in the corners of bunkers and officer mess halls, Die Amerikaner haben Spione. The Americans have spies. The jokes stopped. The smirks faded. Because the war, their war, had a new front, one without borders, one fought in the dark, one they couldn't control. And in that darkness, the OSS thrived. By mid-1943, the OSS had become more than just a gamble. It was a problem for the Nazis, not because they were massive in numbers. They weren't. not because they had better weapons. They didn't. It was because the OSS knew something the Nazis didn't. War wasn't just won by bullets. It was won by doubt, delay, discord, and deception. The OSS inserted itself like a virus behind enemy lines. They recruited locals, farmers, teachers, disillusioned bureaucrats. They bribed border guards, disguised themselves as priests and peasants, and used couriers on bicycles to deliver forged documents. They didn't fight on the front lines. They moved the front lines. One mission, codenamed Operation Ginny, saw OSS agents sneak into Italy dressed as fishermen. Their objective: blow a vital tunnel the Germans were using to move tanks northward. They made it to the target, but they were captured, and what the Germans did next would be remembered forever, not because it stopped the OSS, but because it lit a fire inside them. Instead of treating the men as prisoners of war, the Germans, on Hitler's direct order, executed them. No trial, no uniform, just a ditch and gunfire. It was a message. One meant to terrify. It had the opposite effect. After Ginny, the OSS went harder. They started planting misinformation in Berlin itself, through neutral diplomats and manipulated press leaks. They created entire phantom divisions, units that didn't exist, complete with fake radio chatter, rubber tanks, and double agents feeding the lies directly to German ears. This wasn't chaos for chaos's sake. It was precise. They knew the Germans trusted their intel. They knew Hitler believed the Allies would land in Calais, not Normandy. And the OSS made sure he kept believing that. Operation Bodyguard, Operation Fortitude, entire campaigns of illusion. The Nazis mocked the Americans for being naive, for trying to win a war with decoys and actors. But it worked. Because when the real Allied forces landed at Normandy, the Germans hesitated. They believed it was a diversion. By the time they realized the truth, it was too late. That was the OSS's victory. Not in the beaches stormed, but in the seconds delayed. The decisions questioned, the orders second-guessed. Those seconds saved lives. But sabotage wasn't their only talent. The OSS also hunted secrets: Nazi science, Nazi infrastructure, Nazi weaknesses. They sent agents to infiltrate factories, decode telegrams, photograph blueprints. Some posed as journalists, others as businessmen. A few even married into German families. Deep cover that would last months, sometimes years. One mission, classified for decades, involved an OSS officer parachuting into Austria to investigate rumors of a secret Nazi weapons project. What he found was a mountain facility protected by SS guards and shielded from air reconnaissance. A week later, that facility no longer existed. A chain of sabotage strikes, coordinated by OSS and local resistance, had reduced it to rubble. Another mission involved disrupting German oil production in Romania. The OSS knew Hitler's war machine ran on oil. Without it, tanks stopped, planes grounded, and convoys stranded. They identified weak points in the supply chain: pipes, valves, electrical substations, not easy targets, not explosive, but critical. One OSS-trained saboteur, a Polish mechanic named John, blew a single pressure valve in a refinery complex. It took months to replace. That one valve bottlenecked fuel distribution to an entire panzer division on the Eastern Front. That's how the OSS fought. Small cracks in big machines. And every crack echoed. Even in the Pacific Theater, their fingerprints were felt. The OSS operated in Burma, China, and the jungles of the Philippines, partnering with local fighters, teaching sabotage, gathering intelligence on Japanese troop movements. In one case, OSS officers helped arm and organize a band of Filipino guerrillas who later ambushed a Japanese convoy carrying artillery blueprints. The documents were recovered, translated, and sent to Allied engineers, who used them to build countermeasures. None of this made headlines. None of this was credited. Because the OSS didn't want credit. They wanted results. Their motto said it all. You are not here to win medals. You are here to win the war. And yet, even as their victories stacked up, the mocking never fully disappeared. Some Allied commanders still saw them as cloak-and-dagger cowboys. Too unorthodox, too rogue, too different. But difference was their strength. While armies moved in formations, the OSS moved in whispers. And in those whispers, the Reich began to unravel. By 1944, Hitler himself issued multiple directives targeting OSS operatives for special punishment. To be caught with an OSS-issued cyanide pill or forged documents was a death sentence, not just for the spy, but often for the family who harbored them. The Germans were terrified, and that fear, that was the point. Because fear slowed decisions. It forced changes. It made men lie awake at night wondering, what else don't we know? That was the OSS's war, and they were winning it. By early 1945, the OSS wasn't just behind enemy lines. It was inside the enemy's thoughts. In Berlin, high-ranking officers whispered of ghosts, of leaks that couldn't be plugged, of mistakes that didn't feel like mistakes, but setups. Entire battalions moved based on intelligence that was already compromised. Factories tightened security for attacks that hadn't happened yet. The OSS wasn't everywhere, but it felt like it. And nothing proved that more than the mission no one believed was possible. Not sabotage, not infiltration. Theft. Theft of one of Hitler's greatest secrets. A secret hidden in the forests of Thuringia, buried under reinforced bunkers, guarded by SS loyalists with orders to shoot intruders on sight. The target? The Nazi nuclear program. Few knew it existed. Fewer still knew where. But the OSS had caught whispers, encoded telegrams, intercepted letters, and from a double agent embedded in a high-level scientific circle near Heidelberg. What they learned terrified Allied command. Germany wasn't just experimenting with atomic theory, they were testing components. And if successful, Hitler wouldn't just prolong the war. He could rewrite it. So the OSS was given a new mission. Codename, Operation Alsos. Led by Colonel Boris Pasch, a former military intelligence officer with nerves of steel and a disdain for red tape, the Alsos team was built from physicists, engineers, linguists, and a handful of hardened operatives trained to kill quietly. Their orders? Find the scientists, seize the documents, and bring it all back, or destroy it on the spot. It wasn't a raid, it was a race, because as the Allies pushed toward Germany from the west, and the Soviets surged from the east, Hitler's top minds were evacuating. Labs were being burned, files hidden, equipment destroyed. The OSS had to strike before it all vanished, or worse, fell into the hands of Stalin's NKVD. They tracked rumors to a small village near Heckingen, nestled in the Swabian Alps. There, in an unassuming building camouflaged as a textile facility, they found them. German physicists, stacks of reports, blueprints of heavy water reactors, even uranium samples. The building was raided under cover of night. No shots fired, no alarms triggered. The scientists were taken, some quietly, some at gunpoint, their families left behind. Within 24 hours, they were being questioned by American physicists fluent in German, flown in specifically for this operation. One OSS agent later recalled, "They weren't surprised we found them. They were surprised we understood what they were building." The information gathered changed everything. It confirmed suspicions, validated fears, and most importantly, it shut the door. The Nazi nuclear dream was over. The OSS didn't just steal Hitler's science, they strangled it in its crib. And the best part? No one saw it coming, Even after Germany fell, even after Berlin burned and Hitler's bunker turned to ash, few knew the true scale of what had just been prevented. Because that's how the OSS worked. Quietly, deadly, and always 2 steps ahead. In the months that followed, OSS officers turned their attention to post-war cleanup, Operation Paperclip, Operation Sunrise. They identified Nazi scientists useful to the US, and those too dangerous to live freely. They intercepted communiques from Soviet agents trying to flip assets. They tracked fleeing SS officers across continents. One team even found a hidden cache of documents in a barn outside Munich, a trove that included names, payrolls, bribe lists, and dossiers on European collaborators. That information would later fuel dozens of war crimes trials. And again, no medals, no speeches, just a flight home, a quiet debrief, and a file stamped classified. Because the OSS didn't seek glory, they sought results. The war ended, the flags fell, the tanks stopped moving, the rifles were stacked, the headlines screamed victory. But in the quiet corners of the world, a different war continued. Because when the guns go silent, the secrets start speaking. And no one knew that better than the OSS. By summer 1945, the Nazis were defeated, but their networks weren't. SS officers were vanishing, collaborators were slipping into shadows, and in cities across Europe, strange whispers began to surface, of files missing from Reich archives, of art disappearing, of gold convoys never found. The OSS didn't go home. They stayed, because victory wasn't just about ending the war, it was about controlling the peace. That's when the mission changed. The OSS turned from saboteurs to architects. They were tasked with tracking down Nazis who might still pose a threat, not just as soldiers, but as symbols, icons of hatred, masters of ideology. The men who'd built the machine. They called it the Nazi rat lines, underground escape routes running through Austria, Italy, Spain, and all the way to Argentina. The goal? Stop the rats, one by one. A team of OSS officers embedded themselves in post-war Rome, posing as diplomats, translators, even monks. They intercepted forged Vatican travel documents. They tracked currency transfers used to fund escapes. They infiltrated churches known to harbor war criminals. It wasn't always clean. It wasn't always official. But it worked. Dozens of high-ranking Nazis were intercepted, including logisticians, chemists, and Gestapo agents trying to vanish into civilian life. One OSS operative posed as a Red Cross worker, scanning refugee rosters for code names tied to war crimes. His cover was nearly blown twice, but he kept going, because the alternative was letting evil walk free. Then came a mission more complex than any before. Operation Paperclip. The United States government, now staring down the barrel of the Cold War, realized something chilling. The Nazis weren't the only ones building rockets. The Soviets were hunting Nazi scientists too. The race for space had begun, before the dust had even settled in Berlin. The OSS was tasked with identifying and extracting German engineers who had worked on V-2 rockets and early jet propulsion before the Soviets could get to them. It was ugly. Many of these scientists had willingly worked for Hitler. Some had used forced labor. Others had turned a blind eye to atrocities. But now they were assets, and the OSS did what was asked. They moved them, quietly, carefully, to American bases. They erased trails, forged new IDs, constructed cover stories. Some of these men would go on to design America's space program. Others would help build missiles aimed right back at the USSR. The OSS wasn't proud of it, but they understood it, because the new war was colder, smarter, and fought in the shadows, their kind of war. Meanwhile, others in the OSS turned their attention to a different kind of target: knowledge. The Nazis had stolen everything, from artwork and gold to patents, rare manuscripts, even psychological research. Hidden in salt mines, castles, and abandoned estates were vaults of stolen genius. The OSS created the Art Looting Investigation Unit. Their job: find it, catalog it, return it, or, in some cases, keep it from falling into the wrong hands. They discovered hundreds of priceless artifacts, including Da Vinci sketches, Gutenberg Bibles, and entire private collections belonging to Jewish families erased from history. For every crate recovered, there was a story, and behind every story, a person. The OSS saw themselves not just as soldiers, but as stewards of memory, because war destroys more than cities. It erases names, and the OSS fought to preserve them. One officer later said, "We weren't just chasing Nazis, we were chasing ghosts. We were trying to bring order to a world that had unraveled." And yet, for all their victories, the OSS was a contradiction, too independent for the Army, too unconventional for the State Department, too effective to ignore. And in October 1945, with the war over and the public demanding peacetime simplicity, President Truman issued Executive Order 9621. The OSS was officially dissolved. Just like that. Gone. The operatives were reassigned, the files buried, the history locked away. It should have ended there, but the shadows never really disappear, because by the time Truman signed the order, the world had already changed. Germany was divided, the Iron Curtain was falling, and the Cold War had begun. The OSS had vanished from the headlines, but it had not vanished from the world, because its people, its operatives, analysts, field agents, and case officers didn't forget how to work in the shadows. They didn't forget the codes, the safe houses, the scent of danger just before it hits, and neither did the United States. By 1947, the world was a different place. No longer split between Allies and Axis, now split between freedom and control, between West and East, between Washington and Moscow. And in that divide, a new agency was born. The CIA. It rose from the ashes of the OSS. Not identical, more structured, more political, but forged in the same fire. And many of the OSS's finest walked through that door. They brought with them everything they had learned in the fight against fascism, but turned it now toward a world increasingly defined by subtlety over shock. The Cold War wasn't about battlefields, it was about secrets. And in that war, the OSS was more than a memory, it was a blueprint. Because in the 1940s, before satellites, before drones, before digital footprints, the OSS had done it all with chalk, with wires, with whispers and maps and guts. They had proved that information could shape history, that sabotage could save thousands, that one agent with a forged passport and a suicide pill could shift the course of an entire region. But even as its legacy lived on, the OSS itself began to fade. Most Americans never knew what they had done. Their files were sealed, their names withheld, their operations stamped top secret and buried in archives. There were no medals for blowing up Nazi rail lines, no statues for stealing uranium from under Hitler's nose, no documentaries about the saboteur who walked into a German officers' club in Nice, slipped poison into a glass, and walked out without a trace. And yet, the agents didn't mind. They hadn't joined for fame. They'd joined because they believed that someone had to fight the war that couldn't be fought in daylight. Some of them never came back. They disappeared in forests, cities, deserts. Their families received telegrams, not explanations. Some graves are still empty. But those who did return, they carried the weight quietly. They opened hardware stores, taught history, became lawyers, professors, factory workers. They watched the world they helped shape move on, faster, noisier, more complicated. Some were never acknowledged, but others Later in life, long after the documents were declassified, after the secrets were safe, they began to talk. In interviews, in memoirs, in nursing homes. And when they did, you could hear it in their voice. Not bitterness, pride, not arrogance, gratitude. Because they knew something the world had forgotten, that the most dangerous missions are the ones no one sees. That real heroism doesn't march. It whispers. One former OSS officer, in his 80s, was asked if he regretted not being in uniform, not being known. He smiled. "We weren't the heroes you put on posters," he said. "We were the ones who made sure the posters didn't have swastikas on them." Today, only a handful of OSS veterans are still alive. But their legacy? It breathes in every covert operation, every intelligence briefing, every time a threat is stopped before it begins, because the world they shaped still exists, and the shadows they once walked through, still there. They mocked the OSS from the start. They laughed at their ragtag recruits, scoffed at their field manuals, dismissed their sabotage as childish games. But in the end, the Nazis didn't laugh, because the OSS didn't just win battles, they prevented them. They didn't just plant bombs, they planted doubt. They didn't just gather secrets, they changed outcomes. They weren't soldiers exactly, and they weren't spies exactly. They were something in between, something new, something necessary. And because of them, because of the men and women who served in silence, millions lived. Supply lines were cut before bombs fell on Allied convoys. Bridge demolitions saved whole divisions from encirclement. Entire resistance networks rose from nothing because one OSS officer had the courage to train them in a barn behind enemy lines. They paid a price for that silence. Many died alone. Many were never named. Many have tombstones that don't hint at what they truly did. But that's why you're here. That's why Ghosts of World War II exists. To say their names, to carry their stories, to honor the ones history almost forgot. Because the shadow war they fought still echoes today, in every embassy, in every intelligence report, in every anonymous agent standing between order and chaos. They were mocked. Until the trains stopped running, until the bridges blew, until the scientists vanished, until Hitler's last best hope, his secret war machine, was taken from under his nose. By operatives he never saw, by heroes no one ever credited, by the OSS. If this story moved you, tell someone. If you have a name in your family tree tied to these shadows, share it in the comments. And if you want to help us preserve these voices, subscribe, stay with us, and help keep their legacy alive. Because ghosts only disappear if we let them. This is Ghosts of World War II. And the OSS, they're still watching.